Sometimes the most dangerous moment is not when a man finally speaks, but the few seconds before he decides that silence is no longer possible. Inside the church, titles, discipline, tradition, and carefully chosen words can conceal very human struggles: pride, fear, disappointment, ambition, and the painful feeling of being overlooked. Most of the time, those emotions remain hidden behind calm faces and solemn ceremonies. But every so often, something breaks through, and when that happens, the real conflict is rarely only between two people. It begins much earlier, inside the heart of someone who has spent years convincing himself that he is defending what is right. On one unforgettable day, that hidden struggle was about to become visible. And once it did, nothing in the room would feel ordinary again. Brothers and sisters, pause for a moment. What you are about to hear is not an ordinary account. It was not born from gossip, imagination, or a dramatic tale invented simply to attract attention. It began inside the most sacred setting of the Catholic Church, in the heart of St. Peter's Basilica, during a celebration expected to unfold with solemn order. Hundreds were present, and countless others were watching from afar. No one had any reason to believe that within seconds, the atmosphere would change so completely that bishops, cardinals, priests, and faithful alike would be left struggling to understand what they had just witnessed. Then a voice cut through the silence. "The papacy should have been mine." For a brief moment, the basilica seemed to freeze. The sentence carried across the marble, rose into the immense vaults above, and returned into a room where almost no one moved. Some appeared stunned. Others simply stared toward the altar, as though waiting for someone to explain what they had just heard. Pope Leo XIV remained at the ambo. One hand rested near the lectern, while the other still held the homily text he had been reading moments before. What stood out was not anger, but composure. His expression remained steady, even as tension spread through the basilica. Across from him stood Cardinal Victor Lazzari, dressed in red and long regarded as one of the Vatican's most influential and intellectually formidable figures. He was admired by many, intimidating to some, and accustomed to being taken seriously. Yet that morning, the man behind the office was becoming increasingly visible. His face was tense, his frustration difficult to conceal, and years of conviction appeared to be colliding with something far more personal. What made the moment especially extraordinary was the setting itself. Public disagreement with a pope is one thing. Interrupting a liturgical celebration before the faithful is something entirely different. In a church where ritual, hierarchy, and public conduct carry enormous weight, Lazzari had crossed a boundary few would ever consider crossing. He spoke again, now with greater force. "Your Holiness, you have moved away from the approved text. Words that have not been properly authorized can create confusion. The teaching of the Church cannot simply become a matter of personal interpretation." The reaction around him was immediate. Priests exchanged uneasy looks. Some among the faithful raised their hands toward their faces. Several cardinals remained completely still, perhaps recognizing that this was no longer a minor disagreement over wording. Yet the deeper issue had not fully surfaced. A different kind of silence settled over St. Peter's Basilica. Not the peaceful silence of prayer, but the silence that comes when everyone senses that something serious is unfolding and no one knows where it will lead. Pope Leo XIV did not answer at once. That restraint only sharpened the contrast between the two men. Lazzari remained standing, breathing more quickly now. His hands showed a slight tremor despite his effort to control them. For years, he had believed that the Church's strength depended on discipline, carefully reviewed language, precise documents, and firm boundaries. In his mind, deviation was never harmless. It created uncertainty, and uncertainty could become danger. That conviction helps explain his reaction. But conviction alone does not always explain human behavior. Even experienced churchmen remain human beings, and under pressure, principle, fear, disappointment, and pride can become difficult to separate. To understand how Cardinal Victor Lazzari reached the point of challenging the successor of Peter in public, we have to return only a few minutes earlier. Because the morning had begun very differently. That morning, St. Peter's Basilica looked majestic. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the massive stained glass windows, casting beams of golden light onto the white marble. The choir chanted ancient Latin hymns, while thousands of believers filled every pew, aisle, and corner of the temple. The atmosphere conveyed peace. Everything seemed to follow standard protocol. At the ambo, Pope Leo XIV held the official text of the homily, carefully prepared by the Vatican's theological team. Every word had been reviewed. Every phrase had been approved. Everything was designed to avoid any misunderstanding. However, something began to change. At first, it was almost imperceptible. After reading several paragraphs, the Holy Father slowly looked up, closed the book for a moment, and began to speak from the heart. His voice remained calm, but he was no longer merely repeating the prepared text. He spoke of real people, of families suffering in silence, of young people searching for God in a noisy world, and of men and women who, even within the church, felt they had lost hope. Every word seemed to reach directly into the hearts of those listening. Many of the faithful were visibly moved, unable to tear their eyes away from the Pope. It was a different kind of homily, closer, more human, and alive. But not everyone shared that sentiment. A few feet from the altar, Cardinal Victor Lazzari watched every move of the pontiff. His expression shifted with each improvised phrase. He pressed his lips together, crossed his hands, and nervously tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair. To him, this was not spontaneity, it was a risk. He believed the Church needed precision, not improvisation, clear rules, not personal interpretations. The more the Pope spoke, the greater the unease grew within him. The cardinals, seated around him, began to notice his nervousness. One leaned in discreetly. Victor, stay calm." Another gently placed a hand on his arm, trying to soothe him. But Lazzari was no longer listening. His attention was fixed entirely on the Holy Father. Then came the phrase that finally broke his patience. The Pope raised his eyes toward the congregation and said with absolute serenity, "True fidelity is not born of fear. It is born of faith." When we try to control every single word, we sometimes stop listening to the voice of God, who is always capable of surprising us. Those words struck the cardinal's heart like a personal accusation. He felt that all his years dedicated to defending doctrinal rigidity were being called into question before the entire world. His breathing quickened. His pride began to overrule his prudence. And at that precise moment, he made a decision that would forever change the course of the service. Without asking permission, without waiting for the end of the homily, Victor Lazzari slowly stood up. Everyone present turned their heads at the same time. The slight rustle of the cardinal's purple robe was enough to shatter what remained of the calm in the basilica. No one understood what was about to happen. For centuries, ceremonies held in that place had followed a solemn and precise order. Disagreements existed, but they were never exposed in such a manner, much less before thousands of the faithful. Victor Lazzari took one step forward, then another. His shoes echoed against the marble as he advanced slowly toward the altar. With every step, the tension mounted. Some bishops lowered their eyes, others began to pray in silence. Even members of the Swiss Guard exchanged glances, uncertain whether to intervene or stand fast. Pope Leo XIV continued to watch him with complete composure. There was no anger on his face, only a tranquil expression, as if he understood that behind this behavior lay something far deeper than a mere argument. When Lazzari arrived within a few feet of the ambo, he raised his voice. "Your Holiness, what you are saying does not belong to the approved text. You are abandoning the homily prepared by the Theological Commission. You are speaking according to your own feelings, and that can cause confusion among the faithful." A murmur rippled through the temple. Many began looking at the book lying open on the ambo. It was true. The Pope was no longer following the official text. He had chosen to speak freely. Lazzari continued with growing firmness. "The Church cannot be guided by emotions. It needs clarity. It needs rules. It needs its pastor to announce only that which has been carefully discerned. The Holy Father remained silent. That calm bewildered the cardinal even further. He expected a reprimand. He expected an immediate response. But he encountered only a serene gaze. That silence fueled the frustration he had accumulated over the years. He took another step forward, now standing almost directly in front of the Pope. "With all due respect, Holy Father, I ask you to return immediately to the authorized text. If you continue down this path, I will be forced to officially report this situation to the College of Cardinals." The words fell like a thunderbolt. Several cardinals turned pale. This was no longer a simple observation. It was a public challenge to papal authority. But Victor Lazzari was not finished. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a few seconds, and uttered the words he had kept hidden for far too long. Someone had to say it, because many here think the same thing, even if they don't dare to speak. He looked directly at the Pope again, his voice echoing with a force that shook the entire basilica. "That place should have been mine!" The silence was absolute. Neither the choir, nor the faithful, nor the priests. No one was able to react. The cardinal continued, incapable of stopping himself. "I was the one who should have occupied the chair of Peter. I was the right candidate. I was the one who should have led the church." The words felt heavier by the second, as if pronouncing them was crushing Lazzari's own heart. Thousands of eyes turned immediately toward the Holy Father. Everyone expected a forceful response or a public reprimand. Some even imagined the ceremony would end at that very moment. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Pope Leo XIV lowered his eyes toward the homily book. Without haste, he closed it, rested it carefully on the ambo, and drew a slow breath. Then he looked directly at the cardinal. "Cardinal Lazzari, why are you so certain that I am wrong?" The question caught everyone off guard. After such a public challenge, many expected an immediate correction, perhaps even an order to stop. Instead, the Pope answered with a calm question. It was simple, but it forced the argument away from spectacle and back toward conscience. Lazzari inhaled deeply, trying to recover the confidence that had carried him this far. "Because the Church needs certainty," he replied. "The faithful need clarity, not spontaneous interpretations. Doctrine cannot be shaped by personal emotion." He moved slowly before the altar as he continued. "For generations, the truth has been safeguarded through discipline. Words spoken here matter. If we begin treating them casually, confusion follows." A few cardinals gave restrained nods. Others remained perfectly still, unwilling to reveal where they stood. Pope Leo XIV allowed him to finish without interruption. Then, with the basilica quiet once more, he answered, "On one point, Cardinal, you are correct. Truth must be guarded. But guarding truth is not the same as trying to control the way God may speak." Several faces turned immediately toward the Pope. Doctrine matters. Clarity matters. But if fear makes us examine every word so rigidly that we no longer leave room to hear the Holy Spirit, we may protect the structure and still lose sight of the gospel at its center. Lazzari's hands tightened. The words touched the very convictions around which he had built decades of service. For a man who had long associated discipline with fidelity, the distinction was deeply unsettling. He opened his mouth, ready to answer. He never got the chance. A faint vibration passed beneath the marble floor. At first, it was so slight that many dismissed it as nerves, or perhaps the strange sensation that sometimes comes when an entire crowd stands under unbearable tension. Then, the candles nearest Cardinal Lazzari began to move. Their flames leaned gently from side to side. Nothing else around them appeared disturbed. The great fixtures above remained still, and candles farther away continued burning normally. Yet those closest to the cardinal flickered with an unusual, steady motion. The faithful began whispering. One woman instinctively reached for her husband's hand. A nearby priest shifted backward. Members of the choir glanced toward one another, and the singing gradually stopped. For the first time, Lazari seemed genuinely unsettled. He studied the candles, then searched the basilica, as though expecting to find an ordinary explanation. None was immediately visible. His breathing quickened. And then attention shifted toward the floor. A pale glow appeared on the marble between the Pope and the Cardinal. At first, it could easily have been mistaken for sunlight passing through the basilica's windows. But as people looked upward, there seemed to be no obvious source corresponding to it. The glow slowly became more defined. Before the watching congregation, it formed what appeared to be a luminous circle across the marble. No one moved closer. The light seemed to strengthen gradually, its brightness changing almost rhythmically. The circle widened until its edge reached the feet of Pope Leo XIV. Then it stopped. A profound silence swept across the basilica. Thousands of eyes remained fixed on the floor. People searched for a reasonable explanation, a window, a lamp, some hidden reflection. But in that moment, none was apparent. Cardinal Lazari stepped backward instinctively. The firmness with which he had confronted the Pope only moments earlier began to disappear from his face. The candles nearest him still flickered, while the rest of the sanctuary appeared undisturbed. The murmuring faded. The choir was completely silent now. Even the restless movement of the crowd seemed to stop. Whatever explanation might eventually be offered, the people inside St. Peter's Basilica understood one thing immediately. The confrontation had suddenly become something none of them had expected. The luminous circle kept pulsing slowly, each flash more intense than the last. Then, without anyone being able to identify its source, a single word pierced the temple. It was not a shout or a loud noise. It was barely a whisper, yet everyone heard it with absolute clarity. Enough! The word did not seem to originate from a specific point. It did not descend from the ceiling, rise from the altar, or come from any speaker. It was as though it echoed simultaneously within every heart. A chill ran through the basilica. Several of the faithful began to weep without understanding why. Others sank slowly to their knees. The priests stood frozen, unable to look away from the altar. Victor Lazari felt the weight of his own words crush down upon him. The papacy should have been mine. That phrase, which seconds ago he had spoken with pride, now weighed heavily on his conscience. It became hard for him to breathe. His heart pounded in his chest. For the first time since the clash had begun, he felt genuine fear. Meanwhile, Pope Leo XIV remained completely composed. He did not step back or show fear. He simply walked forward slowly until he stood at the edge of the circle of light. He did not cross it, but stood there observing it with profound reverence. Then he raised his eyes to the cardinal, his voice remaining calm. "Cardinal Lazari, you asked for clarity. I believe the Lord has just granted it to us." A gasp of astonishment echoed throughout the basilica. Victor Lazari tried to react, his lips moving several times before he managed to speak. This must have an explanation. Perhaps it is an effect of the light, an illusion, some physical phenomenon. Even he did not sound convinced by his own words. At that moment, the circle illuminated with even greater intensity, its radiance reflecting off the white marble and the cardinal's vestments. Lazari's breathing grew ragged, his legs began to tremble, and he was no longer arguing with the Holy Father. He felt he was standing before a reality far greater than himself. Suddenly, his strength deserted him. His knees struck the floor, leaving him kneeling before the altar with his head bowed and his voice broken. I have challenged the Holy Father. I interrupted the celebration, and now I do not know what is happening." The Pope approached slowly, and, with a gesture filled with compassion, placed a hand on the cardinal's shoulder. There was no judgment in his eyes, only mercy. "Victor, loving the truth is never a mistake. The error begins when we believe that God can only speak in the ways we expect him to." Those words hung suspended in the silence. Just when it seemed that everything was over, the luminous circle pulsed once more with even greater intensity, and the entire assembly held its breath. The light expanded slowly. It did not blind or burn. It was a serene yet intense clarity that seemed to pierce the hearts of everyone present. No one dared to utter a word. Cardinal Victor Lazari remained kneeling, unable to avert his eyes from the ring of light. He felt the pride he had nurtured for so many years crumbling before the entire church. Pope Leo XIV stood a few steps from him. He did not use the moment to humiliate him, nor did he raise his voice or recall the offenses he had just received. He simply stayed there beside him. That gesture deeply moved many of those present. While silence dominated the basilica, a new vibration rippled through the floor. This time it was deeper, not like a quake, but as if the ancient temple itself were slowly breathing. Several priests looked at the ground anxiously. Some of the faithful looked up toward Michelangelo's immense dome. Everything remained intact, yet the atmosphere had completely changed. Then something even more surprising occurred. A single beam of light descended from the highest point of the basilica. It did not illuminate the altar, nor did it fall upon the Pope. It descended directly onto Cardinal Victor Lazari. The entire congregation watched the scene in awe. The light enveloped the cardinal with an indescribable gentleness. It did not feel like a punishment or a sign of triumph. It was as if that clarity were calling out to him. Lazari slowly raised his face, tears streaming down his cheeks uncontrollably. For the first time in many years, he stopped thinking about titles, authority, and prestige. He saw only the immensity of his own smallness before God. The Holy Father took a step toward him, his voice serene. "Stand up, Victor." The cardinal slowly shook his head. "I am not worthy. After what I have just done, how can I stand before the Lord?" The Pope responded with unexpected tenderness. "No one stands by their own merits. It is God who lifts up those who recognize their fragility." The Pope's words reached Lazari with unmistakable force. Slowly, he pressed one hand against the marble and pushed himself upright. His legs were still unsteady, but his expression had changed. The man who only minutes earlier had spoken from wounded pride now looked more like a believer trying to understand what had just happened to him. As he found his footing, the beam of light seemed to move with him. Then it shifted gradually toward the altar, drawing every eye in the basilica in the same direction. No one spoke. Pope Leo XIV watched for a moment before turning toward the faithful. "Do not be afraid," he said quietly. "When God speaks, it is not to destroy his children. It is to call them back." Then another sound entered the basilica. It was not coming from the choir, and no instrument appeared to be playing. A low, distant melody seemed to rise through the vast space, unfamiliar, yet strangely peaceful. Some among the faithful began to cry without fully understanding why. The music grew slowly. There were no recognizable words, no familiar language, yet the atmosphere changed again. The tension that had dominated the basilica only moments earlier gave way to something deeper and more contemplative. Everyone remained focused on the altar. Then a voice was heard. Its source could not be identified. "Speak, my servant." The effect was immediate. Heads bowed throughout the basilica. Some of the faithful wept openly, while several priests dropped to their knees. Pope Leo XIV closed his eyes and breathed deeply. "Here I am, Lord," he answered. "I hear you. But I am not the only one who needs to listen. Your church must learn to hear you again." Silence returned. Then the voice came once more. "Tell them I have not been silent." A brief pause followed. "Tell them I have never left them." Lazari stood motionless behind the Pope. The resistance that had defined him earlier seemed to be disappearing with every word. The voice continued. "Tell them I am still calling my people." The Pope lowered his head. His eyes were wet now, and the message seemed to weigh not only upon the congregation, but upon those entrusted with leading it. Then came another statement. "You have guarded my words, yet too often you have forgotten to seek my presence. You have defended what was built, but you have sometimes forgotten the heart." The words did not produce outrage. Instead, They produced reflection. People looked downward. Priests remained still. Even those who had watched the confrontation with certainty now seemed drawn inward, toward questions no one else could answer for them. Pope Leo XIV finally spoke again. "Lord, what do you ask of us?" The light around the altar appeared to grow stronger. The atmosphere seemed different as well, not warmer in any ordinary sense, but closer, almost intimate. Then the response came. "Listen again." Silence. "Trust again." Another pause. "Return to me." That final phrase seemed to break through whatever restraint remained in the basilica. Tears flowed freely, not because the words sounded like condemnation, but because they sounded like an invitation, a return, a beginning again. The light remained over the altar, but by then it was no longer the only thing holding the congregation in place. No one seemed concerned with time. No one was thinking about leaving. Pope Leo XIV remained on his knees. A few steps behind him stood Cardinal Victor Lazzari, tears running across his face. For perhaps the first time in years, the question inside him was no longer whether he should have occupied the chair of Peter. It was much simpler. Why had God allowed him to reach this moment? And what was he now being asked to become? Then the voice spoke again. This time, it did not sound forceful. It was gentle, like the voice of a father correcting his children with love. "You have protected my teachings." A brief pause swept through the basilica. "But many times you forgot to listen to my heart." The silence grew deeper still. Those present understood that those words were not directed solely at the cardinals, but to every believer, to all who had ever allowed routine to replace true faith. The Holy Father slowly raised his eyes, his voice reflecting profound humility. "Lord, we have failed so much." The response came almost immediately. "I never stopped seeking my children." Tears streamed down the faces of many of the faithful. Some embraced in silence. Others remained on their knees with hands joined in prayer. The voice continued. "I did not come to condemn you. I came to awaken you." Those words filled the temple with an indescribable peace. Even Cardinal Lazzari felt the weight he had carried for so many years begin to vanish. He realized that his struggle for power had been born of fear of losing control, fear of the church changing, and fear of trusting completely in the action of God. Slowly raising his head, he looked at the Holy Father and said in a broken voice, "Forgive me, not only for having challenged you, but because for a long time I confused authority with pride." The Pope turned to him, a smile full of mercy gracing his face. "Victor, true greatness never consists in not falling. It consists in having the humility to rise when God calls us." The cardinal broke down, no longer attempting to hold back his tears. The entire basilica watched the scene with deep emotion. Two men who minutes before had seemed at odds were now united by the same need for God's mercy. Then something unexpected happened. The light began to rise slowly from the altar. It did not vanish, but ascended toward the immense dome of the basilica, as if returning to the place from which it had come. As it did so, the voice uttered its final words, "My church will remain standing." A pause filled the temple, but it will only remain strong if it walks in humility once more. The radiance grew faint, the song gradually faded, and silence returned to fill St. Peter's Basilica. But none of those present would ever be the same after that moment, because everyone understood they had witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives. The final phrase remained suspended in the air. "My church will remain standing, but it will only remain strong if it walks in humility once more." Then came the silence, not an empty silence, but one that seemed to embrace everyone present. No one dared to speak. The radiance that had filled St. Peter's Basilica slowly began to fade. As the candles returned to burning steadily, the floor ceased its vibration. The mysterious circle of light vanished gradually from the marble as though it had never existed. Yet everyone knew it had been real. Thousands of people had seen it with their own eyes. Pope Leo XIV remained for a few seconds, with his head bowed. He breathed deeply, not attempting to fully comprehend what had occurred, but simply giving thanks. Facing him, Cardinal Victor Lazzari remained on his knees, his pride entirely gone. For years, he had dedicated his life to defending the institution, convinced that protecting the rules was the best way to serve God. Now he understood he had forgotten something essential. He had protected the structures, but he had neglected humility. Tears flowed freely down his face. With an effort, he raised his eyes toward the Holy Father, his voice barely a whisper. "Your Holiness, I do not deserve your forgiveness. I failed you. I failed the Church, and above all, I failed the Lord." The entire basilica remained in absolute silence. The Pope walked slowly toward him. There was no trace of resentment on his face, only deep compassion. When he reached the Cardinal, he extended his hand. "Stand up, my brother." Victor hesitated for a few seconds before accepting the hand. As he stood, his eyes met the pontiff's once more. He expected a reprimand, perhaps a sanction or a suspension of his duties, but the words he heard were completely different. "God's mercy is always greater than our mistakes. Never forget that." The Cardinal could not hold back his weeping. He bowed his head and responded with sincerity. "Thank you. Thank you for responding with love where I offered only pride." Many of those present began to weep as well, not out of sadness, but because they were beholding the true meaning of the gospel. It was not the victory of one man over another. It was the victory of forgiveness over pride. The Pope walked slowly back toward the ambo. He looked at the homily book he had closed minutes earlier, picked it up, gazed at it for a moment, and then set it back down on the altar. This time, he did not reopen it. He looked out at the entire assembly, where thousands of faces awaited his words. With a serenity that filled the basilica, he began to speak. "Today we have all learned something, myself included. We often believe we know perfectly well the path along which God wishes to lead his church. But the Lord never ceases to surprise us. He never stops calling us to a deeper conversion." He paused briefly. "Today, a pope has not won, nor has a cardinal been defeated. Today, we have all been invited to listen to the voice of God once again." A spontaneous burst of applause was on the verge of erupting, but no one actually clapped. That moment did not call for applause. It called for prayer. It called for silence. It called for a heart willing to change. As the Holy Father slowly raised his eyes toward the great crucifix presiding over the altar, a final teaching was about to seal that unforgettable day forever. The Holy Father remained silent for a few moments. His gaze rested on the great crucifix that dominated the main altar. Then he turned his eyes back to the thousands of faithful gathered in the basilica. Never had he seen so many faces marked by the exact same emotion. Some continued to weep, others remained on their knees, and many embraced their family members without uttering a single word. The Pope took a deep breath. Then he spoke with a serenity that filled every corner of the sanctuary. "Brothers and sisters, today we have witnessed something none of us expected. We have not come here to witness a miracle. We have come to celebrate the presence of God. And yet he wanted to remind us that he continues to walk with his church." The entire assembly listened with absolute attention. No one turned their gaze away from the altar. The Pope continued, "For a long time, we have thought that the strength of the Church depends solely on our decisions, our documents, or our organization. But today, the Lord has reminded us of a much simpler truth. The Church stands firm because Christ remains its foundation, not because we are perfect." Those words caused many to bow their heads. Cardinal Victor Lazzari listened to every sentence with eyes full of tears. For the first time, he understood that true leadership did not consist of holding the most important position. It consisted of serving with humility. The Holy Father looked back at him. There was no distance between them. There was no resentment. Only two men aware that they needed the exact same grace. "Victor, Do you know what Peter's biggest mistake was? The entire basilica fell silent once more. The cardinal answered with a trembling voice. He denied the Lord. The Pope smiled gently. Yes, but that was not his greatest mistake. His greatest mistake was believing, for a brief moment, that he could walk without trusting completely in Christ. Even so, it was precisely Peter whom Jesus called back. Those words pierced the cardinal's heart. He understood that God does not choose perfect people. He chooses people willing to let themselves be transformed. Slowly, he took a step toward the Holy Father. Then another, and in front of the entire assembly, he bowed his head deeply. Forgive me, Your Holiness. Forgive me for my pride. Forgive me for allowing my desire to control everything to be stronger than my trust in God. The Pope placed both hands on his shoulders. I, too, need the Lord's mercy every day. Never forget that. None of us is above the grace of God. In that instant, all the tension that had dominated the celebration vanished. What remained was a profound sense of peace. Many realized they had just witnessed something far more important than a dispute between two men. They had seen the power of forgiveness, and that lesson would remain engraved forever in the hearts of those present that morning in St. Peter's Basilica. The celebration was not over yet. However, no one was thinking about the prepared homily or the protocol that was supposed to be followed. Everyone understood that this morning had taken a completely unexpected turn. Pope Leo XIV remained silent for a few moments. Then he turned his eyes back to the manuscript of the homily resting on the ambo. He picked it up, looked at it with respect, but instead of opening it again, set it aside. Then Pope Leo XIV spoke again, this time with a quieter, more deliberate tone. For years we have prepared our words carefully, so that the gospel may be proclaimed faithfully. That is necessary. The Church must protect truth and teach with clarity, but truth can never be reduced to carefully arranged sentences. Truth has a face, and that face is Christ. The basilica fell silent once more. The Pope continued, When we become so concerned with protecting ourselves that we stop looking toward Christ, we can end up defending the Church while refusing to let the gospel change us. Victor Lazari lowered his head. The words struck close to home. For much of his life, he had believed that guarding the institution was the same as serving God. Yet, somewhere along the way, discipline had become entangled with pride. Pope Leo XIV stepped closer to the congregation. Today we have been reminded of something essential. Authority in the Church does not come from status. It comes from service. It does not grow from recognition, but from humility. Anyone who desires to lead must first learn how to kneel. Many in the basilica closed their eyes. The message was no longer only about a cardinal or a pope. It had become personal. Then Leo XIII turned toward Lazari. Brother, this moment was not given to humiliate you. Perhaps it was given because your mission is not finished. Victor lifted his eyes, still wet with tears. After what I have done, can God still ask anything of me? The Pope smiled gently. God does not stop calling someone simply because that person has fallen. Peter failed. Paul once opposed the Church. Yet both became instruments of grace. Why should repentance close the door for you? Something in Lazari seemed to release. The weight he had carried began to ease, and for the first time in years, peace appeared stronger than ambition. The atmosphere inside St. Peter's Basilica was now completely different from the one that had dominated the beginning of the liturgy. The tension had disappeared. In its place was a silence filled with reflection. Pope Leo XIV looked across the faithful, then toward the bishops, priests, and cardinals. Some of you may remember this day because of what you saw. Others may remember the silence that filled this basilica. But I hope that years from now, you remember something deeper. He paused. The greatest miracle is not what appears before our eyes. It is what God begins to change within the human heart. Many lowered their heads. A person can witness something extraordinary and remain exactly the same. But when a heart truly turns back toward God, that transformation can endure long after the moment itself has passed. Victor closed his eyes. For years, he had concentrated on preserving the Church. Now he understood that before he could defend anything faithfully, he first had to allow God to transform him. The Pope moved toward the center of the altar. Never forget this. The Church does not belong to a pope, a cardinal, or any other man. It belongs to Christ. We are servants. We are called to listen before we speak, to love before we correct, and to serve before we seek recognition. The basilica remained still. Many among the faithful were crying, not from fear, but because the words touched struggles that had little to do with Vatican titles and everything to do with ordinary human pride. Leo XIV looked once more at Lazzari. "Brother, nothing has been taken from you today. A different mission has been placed before you." Victor drew a slow breath. "What mission, Your Holiness?" The Pope answered softly. "To remember every day that the greatest honor in the Church is not occupying the highest chair. It is knowing how to kneel before God." Lazzari bowed his head. The man who earlier had spoken as though the papacy belonged to him was no longer visible. What remained was simply a believer who understood that mercy had given him another beginning. As the congregation watched in silence, Pope Leo XIV slowly raised his hands to offer the final blessing. Yet no one appeared eager to leave. The basilica seemed suspended outside ordinary time. Thousands remained where they were, aware that whatever else they might forget about that day, they would remember how completely the human heart before them had changed. Pope Leo XIV slowly looked out over the immense assembly. Tears still glistened on many faces. Others remained on their knees, with hands joined in prayer. Even the cardinals, accustomed to grand Vatican ceremonies, kept their heads bowed. No one wanted to break that moment. Then the Holy Father spoke again. "Brothers and sisters, when you leave this basilica, the world will still be the same. There will be people who continue to suffer, families weeping over the loss of a loved one, young people searching for answers, and men and women who feel that God is silent." He paused briefly, then continued, "Do not expect to convince them with arguments alone. Show them Christ through your lives, because a heart filled with love proclaims the gospel more powerfully than any sermon." The words echoed slowly down the central nave. Many priests felt that this teaching would remain engraved forever in their ministry. The Pope then turned his gaze toward the cardinals. "Our mission has never been to occupy the highest places. Our mission has always been to serve, and whoever forgets that risks seeking their own glory instead of the glory of God." Victor Lazzari lowered his head once more. Those words no longer caused him pain. They brought him peace. He understood that God had permitted that humiliation to rescue his heart before it was too late. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and looked at the Holy Father in front of the whole assembly. He spoke with a sincerity that surprised everyone. "I promise to dedicate the rest of my life to serving with humility, not seeking the first place, but helping others draw closer to Christ." The Pope smiled. "Then today a new chapter has begun for you, because when a heart allows itself to be transformed by God, it is never the same again." The emotion throughout the basilica was palpable. Many understood that the true miracle of that morning was not merely the light, nor the voice, nor the silence. It was the conversion of a proud heart into a heart ready to obey. And that transformation, many present thought, was one of the greatest works that the grace of God could perform. The Holy Father slowly raised his hands. St. Peter's Basilica prepared to receive the final blessing. However, before uttering a single word, he fell silent once more. It was a brief silence, but long enough for everyone to realize there was still something left to say. The Pope looked toward the immense crucifix presiding over the altar. Then he spoke in a serene voice. "Today we have received a lesson that none of us had prepared. We thought we came to celebrate a liturgy, but the Lord has reminded us that the liturgy only makes sense when it transforms the hearts of those who participate in it. Thousands of the faithful listened with total attention. No one took their eyes off the pontiff. We can know the scriptures, we can defend doctrine, we can dedicate an entire life to the service of the Church. But if we forget to love with humility, we will have lost what matters most. The words resonated deeply among those present. Cardinal Victor Lazzari remained silent. Every phrase seemed to turn into a prayer within his heart. The desire to argue no longer existed in him. He only wanted to start over. The Holy Father continued, "Do not allow pride to take the place that belongs only to God. For pride always promises greatness, but ends up leading us away from the truth. Humility, on the other hand, may seem like a small path, yet it always leads to Christ." Many priests slowly bowed their heads. They knew those words were also meant for them, for everyone. The Pope took a deep breath, then looked back at Cardinal Lazzari. "Brother, today your story does not end. Today a new one begins." The Cardinal felt a lump in his throat. In a trembling voice, he replied, "I will do everything I can to be worthy of this opportunity." The Holy Father smiled. "Do not seek to be worthy through your own strength. Trust in God's grace. It is grace that transforms hearts." A deep silence wrapped around the basilica once again. The tension had completely disappeared. The only thing that remained was an immense sense of peace. Finally, the Pope extended his hands over the whole assembly. "May the Lord strengthen your faith. May he never allow fear to be stronger than hope. May each of you always remember that true authority comes from love, service, and humility." Everyone answered as one, "Amen." The echo of that response reverberated through the immense basilica as the bells began to chime, announcing the end of the celebration. No one imagined that this event would continue to be remembered for many years by those who had the privilege of witnessing it. When the last Amen faded beneath the massive dome of St. Peter's Basilica, no one moved. There was no applause, no conversation, only a reverent silence that seemed to envelop every corner of the building. Sunlight continued to filter through the stained glass windows, illuminating the altar where, just minutes before, everyone had witnessed an unforgettable event. Pope Leo XIV remained motionless for a moment. With hands joined, he offered a brief prayer in silence. Then he slowly descended the altar steps. His first destination was not the exit. It was Cardinal Victor Lazzari. Seeing him approach, the cardinal bowed his head once again. It was still hard for him to meet the Holy Father's gaze. Shame continued to weigh heavily on his heart. However, the Pope did something no one expected. He embraced him. It was not a formal gesture. It was a sincere, long, silent embrace. An embrace that spoke of reconciliation far more than any speech could. Many of those present could not hold back their tears. That single gesture summarized everything they had just lived through. Forgiveness had conquered pride. When the two separated, the Pope spoke in a low voice. Only those closest to them managed to hear, "Never forget this day, not because of what happened in front of everyone, but because of what God did inside your heart." Victor nodded with tears in his eyes. "I will remember it as long as I live." The Holy Father smiled. "Then it will all have been worth it." Little by little, the faithful began to leave the basilica. No one spoke loudly. Many walked in silence. Others remained a few minutes longer before the altar, praying. Some priests embraced each other, overcome with emotion. Even several cardinals, known for their reserved nature, could not hide the profound, moved expression on their faces. That day had not merely brought a service to an end. It had begun a period of reflection that would stay with the entire Church for a long time. For everyone understood a truth they would never forget. True authority is never born of pride. It is born of a heart willing to let itself be transformed by God. And that lesson would remain alive long after the doors of St. Peter's Basilica closed again. In the days that followed, the event in St. Peter's Basilica became the sole topic of conversation within the Vatican. There were no photographs capable of explaining what had occurred, nor were there enough words to describe what thousands of people claimed to have witnessed. Each witness recounted the experience differently, yet all agreed on one point. That morning had changed their lives. Cardinal Victor Lazari was among the first to leave the basilica quietly. He did not seek out journalists, gave no interviews, and offered no self-justification or explanation for his behavior. He needed to be alone. As he walked down the long corridors of the Vatican, every step felt slower than the last. Images kept returning to his mind. His defiance of the Holy Father, the silence that had swept through the sanctuary, the mysterious light, and that voice that had pierced his heart. He realized he would never be the same man again. That same afternoon, he asked for another audience with Pope Leo XIV. When he entered the pontiff's private library, he stood still for a few seconds, unable to find the courage to speak. It was the Holy Father who broke the silence. "I'm glad to see you, Victor." The Cardinal lowered his eyes. "I wasn't sure if I should come after everything that happened. Perhaps it was best for me to stay away." The Pope gently shook his head. "No, right now is when we most need to walk together." Those words deeply surprised the Cardinal. He had expected a reprimand, perhaps a sanction, but instead found complete mercy. They sat face to face. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Victor took a deep breath. "Your Holiness, I have dedicated my entire life to defending the Church. But now I ask myself, what if, for years, I was defending my own ideas more than the will of God?" The Pope paused for a moment before answering. "We all run that risk, even I. When we think we fully know the Lord's path, we stop listening to Him with the same humility we had on the first day." The Cardinal slowly raised his eyes. "So, conversion never ends?" The Holy Father smiled. "Never. As long as we have life, God will keep shaping our heart. He will keep correcting us, inviting us to trust more in Him and less in ourselves." Victor felt those words fill the void inside him. For the first time in many years, he experienced a peace that did not depend on title, authority, or recognition. It depended solely on God. And he understood that this was the greatest gift he could receive after everything he had experienced in St. Peter's Basilica. The conversation went on for a long time. Outside the private library, the Vatican carried on with its routine business. Officials walked down hallways, priests attended to their duties, and pilgrims continued arriving from different countries, completely unaware of what was taking place behind those doors. Inside the room, a very different atmosphere prevailed. Cardinal Victor Lazari remained silent, reflecting on everything he had gone through. After a few minutes, he spoke again. "Your Holiness, for years, I thought that the strength of a shepherd consisted in never showing doubt." Pope Leo XIV gave a calm smile. "Some of the greatest servants of God struggled with questions. Moses hesitated. Elijah believed he had been left alone. Peter knew fear, and Thomas needed reassurance before his faith could recover. The issue was never whether they had doubts. What mattered was that they kept searching for God with an honest heart." Victor remained silent. For years, he had treated uncertainty almost like a weakness. Now the Pope was placing it in a different light. "Then God can work through weakness too?" he asked. Leo XIV nodded. "Very often, that is exactly where grace begins to work most deeply. When we stop depending entirely on ourselves, we finally learn what it means to depend on Him." Victor breathed slowly. The conversation was doing more than answering questions. It was exposing wounds he had carried quietly for years, and beginning to loosen their hold on him. After a long pause, he asked one final question. "What should I do now?" The Pope considered his answer for a moment. "Go back and serve with the same dedication you have always had, but not with the same heart. Do not spend your strength defending your own vision. Use it to help others discern what God is asking of them." Victor lowered his head. He understood the distinction. Authority was not about forcing others into line. It was about walking with them. Leadership was not domination, but service. Before leaving, Lazzari reverently kissed the ring of the fisherman. Leo XIII rested a hand on his shoulder. Do not remember the basilica only because something extraordinary happened there. Remember it, because God used that day to remind all of us that conversion is never finished. For the first time since the morning began, Victor smiled. He left the papal library and moved slowly through the Vatican corridors. Nothing around him had changed. The same stone walls surrounded him. The gardens were still outside. The bells sounded as they always had. But Victor was different. Only hours earlier, he had believed he deserved the highest office in the church. Now his ambition had narrowed to something far simpler, to serve Christ faithfully, wherever he was placed. Those who worked with Cardinal Lazzari began noticing the difference almost immediately. His responsibilities remained the same, but his manner changed. The man who once wanted every detail under control began listening more carefully. In meetings, he asked questions before offering conclusions. People who had grown accustomed to his firmness discovered that he was now willing to hear them out. Some wondered whether the change would last. It did. One morning, while walking through the Vatican gardens, Victor met Pope Leo XIV again. They greeted one another quietly and continued along the path together. After several minutes, the Pope asked, "How is your heart, Victor?" The Cardinal smiled. "More peaceful than it has been in a very long time." Leo XIV nodded. "Then God is already at work." Victor looked toward the trees before answering, "I once thought serving God meant proving that I was right. Now I think it means allowing him to be right, even when his will overturns mine." The Pope's expression softened. That answer revealed something more convincing than any public apology could have done. Victor's change was no longer driven by embarrassment. It had become conviction. They walked a little farther before stopping near a small statue of the Virgin Mary. The Pope remained there briefly in prayer. Then he said, "The Church certainly needs men who are educated, but even more, she needs men who are humble. Knowledge can teach us much. Humility gives God room to work." Victor lowered his head. He carried those words with him. Before they separated, Leo XIV shook his hand. Never forget that God can take even our failures and turn them into the beginning of a greater calling. Victor watched the Pope continue down the path. Only then did he fully understand what St. Peter's Basilica had meant for him. It had not been the collapse of his story. It had been its beginning. From that point forward, he no longer woke each morning, wondering how high he could rise within the Church. He asked where he could best serve Christ. Weeks turned into months. Life in the Vatican continued at its usual pace, but those who had been present that day still remembered every moment with crystal clarity. They did not talk as much about the mysterious light or the deep silence that had enveloped the basilica. What remained most in their hearts was the transformation they had seen in two men. A pope who responded with serenity, where anyone else would have reacted with harshness, and a cardinal who found humility when he seemed consumed by pride. As time went on, many priests began citing that day during spiritual retreats, not to talk about an extraordinary event, but to remind others that God's greatest work always begins inside the human heart. One afternoon, while Pope Leo XIV was receiving a group of young seminarians, one of them gathered the courage to ask a question. "Your Holiness, after everything that happened that day, did you ever feel afraid?" The pontiff smiled simply. "Yes." The answer surprised everyone. The seminarian asked again, "And what did you do, Holy Father?" He kept silent for a few seconds, then replied, "I prayed. Because when you don't know what to do, the first thing you should do is place yourself in God's hands." The young men listened intently. Many people believe faith eliminates fear, don't they? "Faith doesn't always make fear disappear," the Pope said. "What it does is prevent fear from making our decisions." Those words remained etched in the minds of the seminarians. One of them commented softly, "So true courage consists in trusting, even when we don't understand everything." The Pope nodded. "Exactly. That has always been the story of the saints. They were not people who never felt fear. They were people who decided to keep walking with God despite it." At the conclusion of the meeting, the seminarians left the room deeply moved. Many realized that serving the Church did not mean pretending to be perfect. It meant learning to rely more on the Lord's grace every single day. As he watched them leave, the Pope offered a brief prayer. He gave thanks for that day that had changed so many hearts and understood that God was continuing to write the history of his Church, not through human power, but through the humility of those willing to listen to his voice. As the months passed, the memory of that liturgy never faded. Pilgrims continued arriving in Rome from every corner of the world. Many entered St. Peter's Basilica without knowing what had happened that day. Others came searching for the exact spot where, according to witnesses, lives had been changed forever. But Pope Leo XIII never allowed attention to center on extraordinary events. Whenever someone asked him about that day, he answered the same way: "Do not look for the sign, look for Christ. For signs only make sense when they lead to him." That answer surprised many. They expected details. They expected explanations. Yet the Holy Father always directed their gaze back to the Gospel. One afternoon, while celebrating Mass in a small Vatican chapel, he delivered a homily that reminded everyone of the lesson of that unforgettable day. The greatest temptation facing a human being is not merely pride. It is also believing that one no longer needs conversion. Every day the Lord calls us again. Every day he invites us to start anew. No matter how long we have served him, there is always one more step toward humility. Among those in attendance was Cardinal Victor Lazzari. He listened to every word with an emotion very different from what he had felt months before. He now understood that conversion was not an isolated event. It was a path to be walked throughout one's entire life. At the end of the service, he approached the Pope. "Your Holiness, thank you for not responding to my pride with pride of your own. If you had reacted with harshness that day, perhaps my heart would never have changed." The Holy Father smiled. "It was not I who transformed your heart, Victor. It was God. I only tried not to get in the way of his work." The Cardinal remained silent. That single sentence summarized everything he had learned. Often, the greatest service a shepherd can offer is simply making room for God to act. As they both left the chapel, the bells began to ring over St. Peter's Square. Their echo spread across Vatican City, and the Cardinal realized those bells no longer reminded him of the weight of an office. They reminded him of a far more important mission: to serve with humility, to listen before speaking, and to trust always that God's grace can transform even the most hardened heart when it finds someone willing to open the door. Those words accompanied Cardinal Victor Lazzari for a long time. Every morning, before beginning his duties, he spent a few minutes in prayer in a small Vatican chapel. He no longer asked for recognition. He no longer sought the most important seat. His only request was simple: "Lord, do not allow me to place my will above yours ever again." Those who knew him began to notice that change. Young priests found in him a man ready to listen. Cardinals discovered a much more approachable colleague. And those who once considered him distant were now surprised to see him stop to talk with pilgrims and Vatican workers. One morning, a young priest approached him with a concern. "Your Eminence, how do you know if you are truly following the will of God?" Victor stayed silent for a few seconds. That question brought back memories of everything he had lived through in St. Peter's Basilica. Then he answered with humility. "When you stop asking what position you want to hold and start asking where you can best serve." The young priest nodded slowly. "So, humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of God first." The Cardinal smiled. "Exactly. And when that happens, many decisions that once seemed difficult begin to become clear." That conversation spread among several seminarians, not because the Cardinal had delivered a grand speech, but because he spoke from an experience that had transformed his life. Meanwhile, Pope Leo XV continued carrying out his ministry with the same characteristic simplicity. He never again publicly mentioned the confrontation in the Basilica, nor did he ever use that episode to single anyone out. On the contrary, he continued to remind everyone in every homily that the Church grows when its children learn to walk together, guided by truth, but also by mercy. As time went on, many came to realize that the greatest lesson of that day was never the conflict. It was the reconciliation. For where pride had attempted to divide, forgiveness succeeded in building a new beginning. And that lesson would continue to inspire everyone who, years later, heard the story of that unforgettable day at the heart of the Vatican. As the days passed, news of that liturgy began to spread far beyond the Vatican walls. Not because extraordinary press releases were issued, nor because the Holy Father spoke publicly on the matter again. The story simply traveled from person to person, from pilgrim to pilgrim, from priest to family. In every telling, one detail never changed. Everyone spoke of mercy. Months later, during a general audience in St. Peter's Square, thousands of the faithful waited for the arrival of Pope Leo XIV. Among the crowd stood an elderly man holding a small wooden cross in his hands. As the Holy Father passed near him, the man raised his voice. "Your Holiness!" The Pope stopped the vehicle and asked to approach. The crowd watched the scene intently. The old man's eyes were filled with tears. "He simply wanted to say thank you." The Pope smiled. "For what, my brother?" The elderly man steadied himself before answering. "Because that day helped me understand something I had struggled with for years. I thought God's love was reserved for people who had never failed. But when I saw you forgive the Cardinal in front of everyone, I realized mercy was meant for people like me too." Pope Leo XIV said nothing at first. Then he reached out and gently held the man's hands. "Never believe you are too far away to return to God. Where there is sincere repentance, there is always a father ready to receive his child." The old man began to weep. Those standing nearby were moved as well. There had been no formal address, no carefully prepared theological argument, only a brief human exchange. Yet, sometimes, a simple encounter carries more weight than a long speech. Before moving on, the Pope added, "The Church is not a home for people who never fail. It is where sinners come to discover the mercy of God." No applause followed. The square remained quiet, as though everyone understood that the moment needed no embellishment. From nearby, Cardinal Victor Lazzari watched in silence. Months earlier, he too had stood in need of mercy. He knew what it meant to be corrected without being discarded, and to receive another beginning where he might have expected only judgment. That experience had changed the way he understood forgiveness. Mercy was no longer something he merely taught. It was something he had received, and that gave him a new responsibility. Victor gradually realized that forgiveness could not remain only a memory from St. Peter's Basilica. It had to reshape the way he lived, led, and treated others. In meetings, decisions, and encounters with the faithful, one principle stayed with him. True authority begins with service. Sometime later, he was invited to address a group of newly ordained priests. Many expected practical advice about theology, leadership, or parish life. Instead, Victor began with a warning. The day you become convinced that you no longer need conversion is the day you should become concerned about your spiritual life. The young priests listened carefully. "I once believed I understood everything clearly. I thought defending the Church meant proving that I was right. But a shepherd never stops being a disciple, and a disciple must remain willing to learn." One priest raised his hand. "Your Eminence, what lesson changed you most?" Victor paused before answering. "Pride is loud. God does not need to be. His voice reaches deeper, but we have to become quiet enough to hear it." The room fell still. The words carried weight, precisely because they were not abstract. They came from a man who knew what it meant to discover his own pride publicly and then have to live differently afterward. Before finishing, Victor offered one final reflection. People may forget much of what we preach. They are less likely to forget how we treated them. They will remember whether they encountered only correction or whether they encountered a pastor. Afterward, several priests approached him. One of them said, "Today I understood that ministry is not about being noticed. It is about helping people come closer to Christ." Victor smiled. For him, that sentence was evidence that even his most painful failure had not been wasted. As he left, he prayed quietly in gratitude. The moment that had once exposed his ambition had become the beginning of another vocation within his vocation. Not the story of a man reaching for power, but of a man learning that Christian greatness begins with humility. Years passed, and the memory of that day spread far beyond those who had actually been present. People remembered the confrontation, but increasingly they spoke more about how it ended. The lasting lesson was not that two churchmen had clashed. It was that mercy had proven stronger than conflict. One afternoon in the Vatican gardens, an aide walking beside Pope Leo XIV finally asked something he had wondered about for a long time. "Your Holiness, if you could return to that day, would you change anything?" The Pope looked upward briefly and smiled. "No." The priest appeared surprised. "Not even being challenged publicly?" Leo XIV shook his head. "No. If even one person found the courage to return to God because of what happened, then the Lord already brought something good from it." They walked several more steps in silence. Then the Pope added, "We often ask God to remove every difficulty from our path. But sometimes the very thing we want him to take away becomes the place where he teaches us to trust him more deeply." The priest nodded slowly, understanding that those words came from someone who had experienced that truth firsthand. Meanwhile, Cardinal Victor Lazari continued serving with the same dedication, but those who knew him noticed a difference. The need to prove he was right had vanished. Now he spent more time listening, more time accompanying others, and more time in prayer. That shift profoundly transformed his ministry. Many young priests began seeking his counsel, not because he was an influential cardinal, but because he conveyed a peace he had lacked before. Whenever anyone asked him about the most important moment of his life, he always gave the same response. "The day I understood that God could change my heart." He did not talk about titles or honors, he talked about conversion, because he had discovered that conversion was the greatest miracle a person could ever experience. As time marched on, both Pope Leo XIV and Cardinal Victor Lazari continued to look back on that day with deep gratitude, not for the extraordinary events that occurred, but because through them, both had understood a truth they would never forget. When humility takes the place of pride, God always finds room to work. In time, that story ceased to belong strictly to the Vatican. It became a reminder for thousands of believers facing their own struggles, doubts, and moments of weakness. For in the end, anyone could see a reflection of themselves in the story's figures. Some identified with Pope Leo XIV, called to respond to conflict with serenity. Others found in Cardinal Victor Lazari a mirror of their own mistakes, their struggles with pride, or the times they had tried to impose their own will rather than listen for God's. And that was perhaps the most important lesson of the entire account, that no one is so far away that they cannot return, and no one is so close to God that they no longer need His grace. Years later, during a spiritual retreat, a priest recalled those events to a gathering of the faithful. After sharing the story, he paused for a moment and asked, "If you had been in St. Peter's Basilica that day, which of the two men would you have identified with?" No one answered immediately. The question was too deep. It forced everyone to look into their own hearts. The priest smiled and concluded, "Perhaps that is precisely God's intention, not to tell us this story so we may judge others, but so we may examine ourselves." His words resonated among those present. Many realized that the true battle does not take place only in the grand events of the Church. It happens every day inside the heart of every believer. It is there that choices are made between pride and humility, fear and trust, seeking one's own will or entrusting one's life to God. And that decision must be renewed every morning, because conversion never ends. As long as there is life, there will always be a new step to take toward Christ. Perhaps that is why, whenever Pope Leo XIV recalled that day, he never spoke of the conflict, the light, or the extraordinary phenomena. He always repeated the same phrase. The greatest miracle was a heart that allowed God to transform it. And that truth remains as relevant today as it was on that unforgettable morning in St. Peter's Basilica. Over the years, those who heard the story often asked the same question. What became of Cardinal Victor Lazzari after that day? The answer surprised many. He did not abandon his ministry, nor did he vanish from public life, nor did he attempt to regain the prestige he had lost. He did something far more difficult. He chose to live every day with the humility he had discovered through that experience. Those who worked alongside him noted that he had changed even in the small details. He listened more attentively, interrupted less, smiled more, and before making an important decision, spent long periods in prayer. When asked the reason for the change, he always answered simply, "Because I realize that God's voice never competes with our pride. It can only be heard when the heart learns to be silent." Those words began to circulate among priests and seminarians. Many wrote them down in their spiritual journals. Others used them as points of reflection during retreats. Not because they came from a famous theologian, but because they came from someone who had personally experienced God's mercy. Meanwhile, Pope Leo XIV continued to serve the Church with the same simplicity he had shown since the first day of his pontificate. He never used that story to elevate his own image. On the contrary, whenever someone praised him for the composure he demonstrated, he answered with humility, "When you truly look at Christ, you understand that forgiveness is always stronger than confrontation." That response moved listeners deeply because it captured the heart of the gospel, not defeating an enemy, but winning back a brother. And perhaps that was the greatest fruit of everything that occurred. Not the wonder, not the mystery, nor even the memory of that day, but the birth of a reconciliation that demonstrated to the entire Church that God's grace is still capable of transforming even the most hardened hearts. That hope remains alive for anyone who humbly chooses to open their life to the Lord once again. Looking back, many realize that those events were never merely about a disagreement within the Church. They were about something far closer to the life of every believer. For all of us at some point have struggled against pride. All of us have wanted things to happen according to our own plans. And all of us have needed to discover that God's will always leads far beyond our own desires. Pope Leo XIV often recalled that truth in his homilies. He mentioned no names and brought up no specifics of the incident. He simply repeated a phrase that became etched in the hearts of thousands. When Christ holds first place, our pride no longer holds it. Those words began to spread through parishes, seminaries, and religious communities, not because they were complex, but because they were profoundly true. Cardinal Victor Lazzari made them his own as well. Every morning before starting his work, he repeated them in prayer. They served as a constant reminder of who belonged at the center of his life. As time passed, many forgot the specific details of the confrontation. Some no longer remembered the exact words spoken that day. But no one forgot the outcome. Everyone remembered the embrace. Everyone remembered the forgiveness. And everyone remembered that mercy had proven stronger than pride. Perhaps that was the lesson God intended to leave behind. For conflicts pass, arguments end, and wounds heal over time. But a truly transformed heart can inspire entire generations. That is why, whenever anyone asked what the greatest miracle of that day had been, those who were present answered the same way. It wasn't the light. It wasn't the silence. It wasn't the awe. The real miracle was watching how God's grace turned a hardened heart into a humble one. That remains the greatest work the Lord wishes to perform in each of us. It is never too late to return to Him, never too late to ask for forgiveness, and never too late to let God write a new beginning in our story. In the end, the passage of time confirmed a truth that none of those present had fully understood that day. God had not permitted that trial to divide His church. He had permitted it to remind us that all authority loses its meaning when it is detached from humility. Pope Leo XIV continued his ministry with the same steadiness people had seen during that unforgettable liturgy. He never tried to turn the incident into a defining image of his pontificate. For him, the lesson mattered more than the spectacle. Extraordinary moments can capture attention for a day, but the gospel is what endures. Cardinal Victor Lazzari, however, carried that day with him permanently. From time to time, he returned to St. Peter's Basilica when it was quiet. He would sit alone, look toward the altar, and pray, not with gratitude for having been exposed, but for having discovered that God had not abandoned him even when pride had clouded his judgment. One day, a young seminarian found him there. "Your Eminence, if you could give one piece of advice to someone preparing to serve the Church, what would it be?" Victor remained silent for a moment before answering. "Never let your need to be right become stronger than your duty to love. Once pride takes control of the heart, we become much less capable of hearing God." The seminarian never forgot those words. Years later, he would say that they changed the way he understood priestly service. In that sense, the story that began with confrontation gradually became known for something entirely different. People remembered the embrace more than the accusation, the mercy more than the tension, and the possibility of beginning again more than the failure that came before it. That is deeply Christian. Christ never taught his disciples to answer pride with greater pride. He called them toward humility, reconciliation, and the difficult work of restoring a brother rather than defeating an opponent. Perhaps that is why this story still asks something of every believer. Are we truly trying to follow the will of God? Or are we simply asking God to approve our own will? That question is uncomfortable precisely because it is human. None of us is beyond pride, and none of us is beyond the need for conversion. But neither are we beyond mercy. As the years passed, the episode was spoken of less as a Vatican conflict, and more as the testimony of a changed heart. Pride may have begun the confrontation, but pride was never the final word. The deeper story was the patience of God, the patience that corrects without abandoning, waits without closing the door, and gives a person room to return. In one of his later reflections on pastoral service, Pope Leo XIV expressed the principle simply: the Church remains credible when she reflects Christ. And Christ does not reject the person who sincerely returns to him. The thought spread through parishes, seminaries, and religious communities because it was not complicated. It was simply the gospel lived in practice. Victor returned to that message often. Eventually, he came to see that the greatest gift he had received was not a title or an office. It was the chance to begin again. That changed the way he counseled others. When someone came to him confused or discouraged, he no longer began with rules. He often began with the question, "How is your heart?" He had learned that structures cannot heal a heart that has drifted far from God. But when the heart returns to Christ, many other things begin to find their proper place. That became the lesson of his later ministry, not the pursuit of influence, but the discipline of humility, not the desire to stand first, but the willingness to serve. Those who heard him knew the words carried unusual weight, because they were not theoretical. They came from a man who had been forced to confront himself and had chosen not to remain the same. In the end, that was why the memory of the day endured. It was not simply a story about division inside the Church. It became a reminder that one moment of grace can redirect a life when a person is finally willing to listen. And the invitation remains the same for us: to examine our pride, open our hearts, and trust God more deeply. No human victory can offer the peace that comes when a person stops fighting for the highest place and begins walking humbly with Christ. Those who had witnessed the events eventually understood something else as well. The extraordinary signs were never meant to become the center of the story. Christ was. It was Christ who gave meaning to the reconciliation, Christ who turned accusation into mercy, and Christ who transformed a man obsessed with position into a servant willing to begin again. Years later, during another celebration inside St. Peter's Basilica, a young priest approached Cardinal Lazzari. He had heard countless versions of what had happened, but wanted to hear directly from the man who had lived it. "Your Eminence, if you could return to that day, would you change anything?" Victor looked toward the altar and remained quiet for several seconds. Then he answered, "Yes, one thing." He paused. "I would have listened to God much earlier, and to my pride much less." The young priest remained quiet, knowing that answer was worth more than any detailed explanation. Victor continued, "We often think our greatest enemy is outside of us, but the hardest battle always takes place inside the heart. That is where we decide whether we trust in God or only in ourselves." As he spoke those words, he remembered the moment he had challenged the Holy Father. It felt like the story of a completely different person, not because he had forgotten what happened, but because God's grace had made him a different man. He looked at the young priest again and added, "Never be afraid to admit your mistakes. What is truly dangerous is not falling. What is dangerous is believing you no longer need to get back up." The priest bowed his head in respect, aware he had just received a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Before departing, the Cardinal offered a brief prayer before the altar. He asked for no honors and sought no recognition. He simply uttered a few simple words. "Lord, may I never forget that everything I am belongs to you." As Cardinal Victor Lazzari slowly walked out of St. Peter's Basilica, he understood that the greatest gift he had received was not the extraordinary sign people would later discuss. It was the change within him, a heart softened, corrected, and renewed by mercy. Years passed, and people continued to debate what had mattered most that day. Some remembered the public confrontation. Others spoke of the silence that seemed to hold the entire basilica still. Many never forgot the mysterious light. But those who understood the deeper meaning came to a different conclusion. The most important thing had not happened on the marble floor or before the eyes of the crowd. It had happened inside a human heart that finally became willing to change. That was the true victory: mercy over pride, forgiveness over resentment, and humble service over the desire for position. Pope Leo XIV continued to guide the Church with the same calm he had shown that day. He never used the episode to elevate himself. When others praised his response, he simply pointed away from himself. All glory belongs to God. When we make room for him to act, even our hardest moments can become instruments of grace. Victor Lazzari lived the rest of his ministry differently as well. He stopped thinking about the highest place he might occupy and began asking where he could be most useful. Those who knew him later remembered a man who listened more, judged less quickly, and carried a peace that had once been missing. Perhaps that is why the story endured. It reminds us that our worst moment does not have to become our final identity. Repentance can open the door to hope. Humility can make room for a new beginning. And when Christ remains at the center, failure never has to speak the last word. The invitation is still ours today, to examine our own hearts, forgive where we can, ask forgiveness where we must, and trust that God's mercy is greater than the pride we struggle to surrender. Because the deepest miracle is not simply seeing something extraordinary, it is allowing God to make the heart new. May the Lord grant you peace, humility, and the courage to begin again whenever you need to. May His grace guide your steps, strengthen your faith, and keep your heart close to Christ. God bless you and your family.